Here we go. Welcome, everybody, to episode 52 of Running into the Fog with the Johnson brothers. Derek, how are you doing today?
52. That aligns with your age, does it not?
As a matter of fact, having been 52 most of the year now, I can relate. Yep. As Grandpa used to say, if I thought I was going to live this long, I would have taken better care of myself.
I remember him saying that. Indeed. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I couldn't be better. And we've got a really exciting guest today, Mr. Robert McBrien. Bob, let's get you into the spotlight here. How are you today, Bob?
I'm good, thank you.
Fantastic. Well, I've heard a lot about you, and you've joined a couple of our live streams, and you've been a great contributor from the audience. Now we get to have you on the panel, so it's really, really exciting that you're here. I want to share a couple of ground rules quick for our audience before we get started. And for those of you on social, first of all, you should know that you can't stay for the whole hour unless you go to openrecon.com and register. So go out to this webpage, hit events, and on the events listing, you can find the next event, hit event detail, and you can register for the live stream and join us here. When you join us here, you have the opportunity to then become an interlocutor. And what do you get when you're an interlocutor? Well, you get a POAP. That's what you get, a proof of attendance protocol token. And I'm actually going to go ahead and reserve my interlocutor token right now using my email address before someone else goes ahead and copies this address into their browser and beats me to it. So mine is now reserved and waiting for me. And we are streaming on social right now. So for those of you on social media, once again, jump back to Open Recon, find the Bob McBrien event for today, get registered, and then join us here on the bridge and have a chance to be an interlocutor yourself. When we go to the half-hour mark, we open it up to our audience and we invite whoever from the audience to come on over, and we turn Bob over to you. So I hope some of you are willing to do that. In the meantime, you can go ahead and scan the Unthinkable POAP from today. And I'll throw up this web address one more time on screen so you have a chance to see that. I'll get it to the screen here in a second, but here's the POAP for now. I'm just going to add that to the spotlight. So Bob, you come very highly recommended and have a long and storied history in government, particularly national security, legal. You spent some time in the Justice Department. I'd like to know, give us the kind of 5-minute overview on how did Bob get to Washington, first of all, and then how did you, start this career?
Well, after law school, I had options, one of which included being drafted. Another one was trying to get into the JAG Corps through an officer candidate program. And while I was waiting to see what came of all of that, I applied to be a VISTA volunteer and was accepted. And even more surprising to me was that my draft board immediately deferred me. So I went to VISTA in Denver, Colorado for a year. And as that wrapped up, I needed to know what I was going to do next in life. That had not led me to any command decision. I did a visit to my law school and came away with the notion that I would go to Washington, D.C. Doing what, I did not know. But being a lawyer was obviously the first concern. So I wrote 18 letters and then caught an airplane and beat the letters to Washington. My first day there, I rode in with the Justice Department lawyer. I rode into downtown DC, and he was nice enough to introduce me to his section chief in the criminal tax division. And an hour later, my first day in Washington, I had my first job offer. I didn't take it. I didn't refuse it. I just said I needed to look at others. That was a heady experience and probably warped me for life. But I did other interviews in Washington. I was catching up with those 18 letters. I had some other opportunities that some I didn't want after I actually had the interview. Others, it's the same answer. I'm waiting to see. And in the meanwhile, I kept hoping I would get into the Justice Department in what I then decided was the best place, the Organized Crime and Racketeering section. And to my, again, surprise in life, I was selected for that and joined the Organized Crime Racketeering section and began a couple of years of a variety of things, from writing affidavits, filing court motions, grand jury. I had a grand jury in Hawaii, which was terrible duty. I did a lot of oversight of electronic surveillance in organized crime cases. Also in those days, I had two, what I would call not normal duties. I was, without any consultation, I was made the executive secretary of the National Council on Organized Crime, which was the Attorney General's interagency organized crime policy body. And I did that for the 2 years I was there. And that was very interesting. Through that, I met most of the cabinet people who were involved and a lot of their subordinates. And I also, in that time, was part of what they called the Campus Visit Program, which was a speakers program sending career lawyers and usually a political appointee around the country to talk to college campuses and civic groups about their Justice Department's policies. And I did a lot of that, to my surprise. While I was at Justice, the Treasury Department one day contacted me and said, "We'd like to talk to you about a proposition we have to bring you over here." And after a little bit of dancing, I said, "I'll talk to you." And I did that. And after on and off for some weeks, I said, "I'll give it a try." And I made a big decision to leave Justice and go to Treasury, which was totally different for me. I would not be formally an attorney anymore. I would be a policy guy. And I had no idea how that would work out. And that was one of these things. I went in with the title of Special Assistant for Special Legislation and Projects. If that was about as amorphous as one could get.
Do you mind if I ask Bob what year that
Sure.
was? Because that lends a lot of context to what was going on in Washington at the time.
That was in the fall of 1972, late fall.
Gotcha. So Derek was just a twinkle in daddy's eye back in those days. I was full on terrible twos by then, but that's helpful. So this would have been Nixon.
Yeah.
I was going to say that move though probably got you out of the crosshairs of John Gotti and his boys. Is that right? Or not?
Probably before Gotti.
I never even thought about that.
I hear you.
We used to kid about that stuff. Weird things that happen. In the organized crime case that grand jury had in Hawaii, that was humorous. My partner and I, who's senior to me, and I were there. We were having dinner our first night in town, and we were being very low key. And we were at a table with a whole group of people eating, and the others, a bunch of the others were from an ABA convention, and they asked us what we were, and we told them we were helicopter salesmen. And they accepted that, and we're sitting there talking, and there's a fellow on my left who's older, and then his wife, and he hears us talking for a minute, and he gives me a bump with his arm and says, "You're full of," and I said, "Pardon me?" And he said, "You're full of," and I looked at him. He said, "You guys are from the Justice Department in Washington, and you're here on an organized crime case. And my wife's the lead for one of the Honolulu dailies."
Wow.
Wow.
And so I nudged my partner and said, we've been made.
Were they tailing you? Was she trying to get an interview or something?
No,
Or did she
it was
just happen
pure
to be
happenstance.
there? Yeah.
Got it. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Bob. Keep going.
So that was interesting beginning. That was a place where I got my first actual death threat.
Huh.
We had a grand jury witness who was, I'll be polite, an alleged hitman. And he and I went out during a break and walked down a lonely corridor, each to get coffee from a machine. And if that didn't kill you, who knew what would? But we were there, and he goes there first, and he puts in money for a cup of coffee, and the coffee's coming out, and he turns and looks at me, and he's got the old dime novel description, gun barrel eyes, black holes looking at me. It said, "Mr. McBrien, I'd like to buy you a cup of coffee." And I said, "Well, thank you." And he said, "With cyanide in it." His English got very good when he said the last part. So we decided, we toyed with whether or not to indict him for threatening a federal officer. We decided that if we mentioned it to the grand jury, they would indict him for that assuredly. And I said, no, it's too good of a war story. So we didn't indict him, and he didn't bring it up again.
Well, you probably had plenty more to indict him on besides that.
That's the most memorable and clear thing. My view is that if somebody's after you, they're unlikely to tell you.
Right on. Well, where'd you go from there? What took you how did you get to the sort of national security role that probably came later?
Well, that didn't come that much later. When I moved to Treasury, I started off doing a lot of legislative reviews, and just a short time, we have to juxtapose my arrival there. We had the Munich massacre at the Olympics of the Israeli team killed by Black September organization.
Right.
And the government was trying to catch up on all of this. It had a lot of work being done interagency on skyjackings, and that was all known as skyjackings. But it didn't have a big interagency in the counterterrorism area. And so there were at first some security things that were begun, and I got sent to those along with Secret Service to see what was going on there and contribute what I could for our office. And then in short order, they created an interagency formal organization to coordinate counterterrorism policy and activities, except in those days they simply called it anti-terrorism. And being the new guy on the block and already with my finger in with some of the Secret Service things, I was the man nominated to be going to the meetings. And that immediately took me into the world of intelligence, because you couldn't do that without all sorts of security clearances. Right. So my introduction into national security and the world of the classified and the what we call today counterterrorism all began there. And that was very interesting, and was, from the ground up.
I'm sure. So you ended up, you were still at Treasury, though. You didn't switch over to an intelligence agency?
I was at Treasury. I was part of Treasury. And, a lot of jobs, when you get on what's called a policy staff, a lot of things are what's coming down the pike and we need somebody on it. And they add you to it. And you maybe carry that with you for your years there, or maybe you switch out. I simply accumulated things as I went along. I didn't get rid of very many things. Sometimes that was good, sometimes that was bad. And I continued some kind of counterterrorism connection really throughout my career and after, when I was a DoD contractor.
Okay. And so since the global war on terror, how did that change when Al Qaeda sort of entered the crosshairs there predominantly?
Well, without going into detail, Al Qaeda had been in the crosshairs before they did anything. A lot of the books will talk about it. I mean, Al Qaeda wasn't a new phenomenon to the government. What they were going to do was new.
Right.
I'm not saying the fact that they were a threat wasn't new, but what they did was new. I won't opine on whether or not it was unthinkable. It happened, and we weren't adequately prepared, if one could be prepared, to deal with that kind of threat. 9/11 was strange for me. By that time, I had gone through several iterations within Treasury of what I did. I had been off on a sabbatical twice. I was back in, and I had been moved to the Office of Foreign Assets Control. They're the sanctions people. And when I joined that place, my new boss was new there too. He and I had been colleagues for a while. And he said, what can we do to make this organization do something meaningful in its sanctions work? And we worked on that, and we came up with some ideas, and one of which I had the lead on was using what we called the Specially Designated Nationals List, the SDN list, which was an old World War II instrument for naming the entities of the Third Reich, mainly in those days. And so we could cut off transactions with them and block their property. We reinvented that, and starting with some trial use with Cuba sanctions, then Panama, and then, to our surprise, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and we used it big time. In those days, big time meant more than 100 designations against Iraq. And basically it blocks property and cuts off all transactions with the institutions or persons that we name. And that was a big, big change. There were enough names coming out under that program that OFAC, which is a tiny little organization those days, we took to taking our published lists as they went out, were going out in the Federal Register, and even preliminary to them getting in the register, we would put stacks of them on the radiator in the vestibule of our building, the Treasury Annex. And all the big law firms in Washington would send runners over to get copies of it and take it back and transmit it out to the banking community.
Sure.
And that's how we started getting the notifications out of those programs. And it became known as the radiator list. And we used that through a large part of the initial year plus of the Iraq sanctions. In those times, we developed a whole compliance team and system run by a former banker, and of course, formalized the whole process. And today it's a very big scale operation. I kind of entertain myself at times by saying, one thing I helped do in my career was I helped launch thousands of others, because all of these compliance people that the banks and other institutions have today have checking the SDN list and the related regulations very carefully, because OFAC's a rather unforgiving agency. All of that compliance work has created all of these jobs, many of which are filled by former employees of mine.
I was going to ask you, Bob,
Yeah.
so if you had still been working earlier this year when the sanctions were imposed on Putin, and that would have essentially put you right in that kind of spotlight doing that same type of thing in a current state environment. Is that right?
Yes, right. Except it's more complex today. In the intervening years, we created other forms of lists that don't all do exactly the same thing. It's a lawyer's paradise. It's not anybody else's, but it's a lawyer's paradise trying to define what fits within one category and not the other, and why. Why usually doesn't matter, but it may matter to somebody because it may affect their business. But yeah, I missed that. I would have found the hunt for Putin's parties thrilling.
Well, and I'm sure, criminal innovation has developed a lot of, ways around the restrictions that might have been put in place in earlier generations. And so I'm sure they're coming up with ways to continue to transact. I was researching over the weekend when I've got a little downtime. I discovered that Russia and India are doing their oil trade in Emirati dirhams right now, which of course is pegged to the dollar and is a very stable currency. And, so that being one of those innovations in order to skirt the SWIFT system, presumably, that they can then do business through the UAE. Am I wrong about that, or that's my interpretation anyway?
I'm not sure exactly of the details of how they're doing that, but yes, that would be a skirting mechanism. Now, I think OFAC can work a way around that anyway. I think the U.S. government can deal with the Emiratis and have talks with them.
Mm-hmm. Talks, encouraging talks. I'm sure.
Encouraging talks that would hopefully bring about change. I know when one of the 9/11 after effects was that Treasury, which pre 9/11 or at the time of 9/11 was in charge of Secret Service, Customs Service, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, OFAC, Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. It had about a third of federal law enforcement under it. One of the changes of 9/11 was, without any warning to Treasury, they took all of that away from Treasury except for OFAC. By that time, I'd been in government long enough to be jaded. And I said, well, yeah, they're reorganizing the deck chairs on the Titanic. Things like that happen after big disasters. I'm fully aware of that. And a shock Treasury Department and a even more shocked set of political appointees at Treasury who had run the enforcement side were redefining what do we do. And the thing that was one of the obvious things was that in addition to the OFAC work, there was a lot could be done with the whole financial side of combating terrorism. And Treasury created, and it took a year to make it all flush out in the right way, but they created what is today the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. And it brought all of the resources of the government to bear on fighting the financing economic side of terrorism and support for terrorism. And under that, the Undersecretary Treasury had in those days went all over the world applying pressure on banks and governments to get with the program and stop doing things that provided assistance to terrorist organizations, even indirect things. And that was really a magnificent effort. Had nothing to do with OFAC or others. a brilliant innovation. And are you hearing me?
Yeah, we have a little bit of
Okay.
lag there on your mic.
It was brilliant innovation, and it changed. You're right. It changed the way the U.S. government and the other governments dealt together on financial side of things forever after.
Right. I'm going to pass it back to you, Derek, to take us through the half hour. But before we do that, I want to remind those of you watching online on social, you got to go to openrecon.com and register if you want to stay on for the second half. This first half we call unthinkable because we want to get you thinking things that you might not have thought of before. And Bob, I think you've got us firmly in your grip here so far. When we come back after the half hour, we call it unspeakable because we're going to talk about some stuff that might get us shut down on social. So we let them go ahead and have their way. And we stay here in this more intimate Zoom webinar environment and talk about some things. And by the way, if you feel like cussing at that point, Bob, have at her. But the question I have for you is around Vladimir Putin, really. And in the last couple of days, as the escalation has sort of become announced, you see greater resistance inside of Russia to those intensifications by Putin in the Donbass and Luhansk and where else? I forget the Zaporizhzhia. I don't have the names down, but in the region under dispute. And there's a whole lot of Russians who are leaving Russia. So tell us a little bit about that sort of, whatever you can before we cut social off and get banned on YouTube and whatnot. Give us your kind of appraisal of how far ahead of us was Putin in terms of gaming this out? Because it sure feels like he's thought of a lot of things that we eventually ended up doing, most notably, cutting off Germany's natural gas supply for the winter, which seems like a really unpleasant thing for the months ahead. So tell us a little bit about what you think there. And then Derek, take us home to the half hour.
I'm not confident that Putin thought very far ahead on any of it. If he had, I don't think he might not have invaded. He might have had a better sense of what his forces were capable of. That disparity between what he intended and what they've done on the ground is tremendous. And I have trouble imagining that someone who is as wily and also really uncaring of what others think as Putin would get into a position where he was going to have a pretty obvious failure going on for months on end. He probably had the annexation as a concept from the beginning. When the annexation would occur, probably wasn't laid out in his mind. This is just out of speculation, but that would be an objective. But having it as we have to do it as our only possible face-saving measure probably wasn't in his head. He was probably looking with a more idea on that. What parts of Ukraine will I decide are ours after we've done overrunning them? And of course, they didn't overrun them. So they're back in this position. What you have now, again, from a non-Putin expert, but someone's been around the block, is you've got a former KGB leader in an extremely bad position for himself and his forces. He's cornered and doesn't have much of a way out that looks good to him. And that's a very dangerous time. And that's one of my abiding concerns, is that we've been hearing various levels of nuclear use threat from Putin and his generals and his political people for some months now, and it's just intensified. And the U.S. government has reportedly back channeling them for all of that time, also saying, don't do it. And that's all been stepped up and more public in the last few days. And I think that's also that has to be present, but it's also a Putin attempt at intimidating the West. It's not just, we're not just the only ones the target of that kind of threat. It's all of Europe. It's the Ukrainians, who themselves are very wary of that happening. And so it's, if you can intimidate part of NATO, maybe you can get NATO to ease up on something. Like I said, this makes it a very dangerous time.
Very good. Well, Derek, quick comment from you, and then we're going to turn you over to Terry here, Bob.
Yeah, I had a pretty significant question, Eric, but if we don't get a third interlocutor, why don't you let me go last?
All right.
And we'll go to Terry.
Great. So Terry Thiel, the guy who told us about you, Bob. Terry, he's all yours.
Well, what you gentlemen don't know is that Bob is also a graduate of the National War College. And he, in many respects, was one of my mentors when I first got at the Treasury Department, these many years ago. And Bob, what I'd like to ask you about, because it was while Treasury at the time was part of what is known as the intelligence community, which are different federal departments